Lee Caulfield.
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2?
Guilty.
Truly sorry to everyone I've hurt.
Find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, signed foreperson.
I'm going to, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, Ms. Simmons has asked for a moment to talk with you privately.
Courtrooms can be the stage for some of the most shocking moments in legal history. From abusive language to brutal fights to unexpected confessions, these brutal examples reveal justice's raw emotions and harsh realities.
To the murders of 48 women, he'd made a deal to cooperate with the prosecution to provide more information on his victims and the whereabouts of their remains.
Let's start with our first case, Gary Leon Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer. His story began in the early 1980s, when he began a violence that would claim the lives of at least 49 women, primarily sex workers and runaways in Washington state. Ridgway's method was horrifyingly organized. He would pick up weak women, often under the disguise of offering them a ride, before sexually assaulting and choking them. He then disposed of their bodies in remote areas, particularly near the Green River, which ultimately led to his nickname.
As charged in count 2.
Guilty. Guilty. Guilty.
It's like he didn't have any remorse at all for what he had done. You know, he'd killed so many people, he didn't remember who they were, what they looked like. I just couldn't believe that somebody could kill all those people and not remember them.
You had said your memory, when it comes to all of the women you took, was gone. Our memory is not. In your words, you said that they didn't mean anything to you, but she meant everything to us.
She was a mother, she was a wife, she was a sister, and we miss her.
Gary Ridgway sat there stone-faced as victims' relatives damned him and mocked him.
He's an animal. I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
He's gonna go to hell, and that's where he belongs.
Despite being a suspect since 1982, Ridgway evaded capture for nearly 2 decades. Investigators struggled to connect him to the murders, until advancements in DNA profiling finally linked him to several crime scenes.
Guilty.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 2?
Guilty. Guilty.
On November 30th, 2001, police arrested him at the Kenworth Truck Factory in Renton, where he worked as a spray painter. It marked a turning point in a case that had haunted law enforcement for years.
I hate you. I'm not one of them. You've made it difficult to live up to what I believe, and that is what God says to do, and that's to forgive.
In 2003, Ridgway entered a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. On November 5th, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. His confession was chilling. He admitted to killing so many women that he had difficulty remembering their names or faces. He explained that he targeted prostitutes because they were less likely to be reported missing immediately.
Is your true name Gary Leon Ridgway?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Ridgway, you're charged by a document called an information under this cause number 011102709, a Seattle case, with 4 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. As required by Washington law, I'm going to read verbatim that information to you now. Count 1 reads as follows. I, Norm Mailing, prosecuting attorney for King County, in the name and by the authority of the state of Washington, do accuse Gary Leon Ridgway of the crime of aggravated murder in the first degree committed as follows. That the defendant, Gary Leon Ridgway, in King County, Washington, on or about a period of time intervening between August 1, 1982 through August 15, 1982, with premeditated intent to cause the death of another person, did cause the death of Marcia Chapman, a human being, who died on or about a period of time intervening between August 1st, 1982.
Judge Richard A. Jones presided over the case in King County Superior Court, where Ridgway received an astonishing sentence of 48 life terms without parole. He also faced additional years for tampering with evidence related to each victim.
No physical evidence exists that could link him to the crime.
The courtroom was tense as Ridgway's chilling admissions unfolded, revealing a man who had lived among society while hiding his monstrous actions. As part of his plea deal, Ridgway agreed to help authorities locate the remains of his victims. Over time, he led investigators to several bodies, providing closure to some families who had long awaited answers. Here is the wrap-up of our first case.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've heard. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir.
Let's have a look at another brutal case. Joseph DeAngelo, the man infamously known as the Golden State Killer. His reign of terror transited over a decade, during which he committed a series of brutal crimes across California.
Page 5.
Okay, he's now present.
Between 1976 and 1986, DeAngelo was responsible for at least 13 murders and numerous rapes, instilling fear in communities from Sacramento to Southern California.
As he was destroying your lives, he got to be on his boat, blow out birthday candles, hold his granddaughter, but all the time in the back of his mind, he knew we would get it. You made it personal, and it was personal.
DeAngelo's criminal activities began as a police officer in Exeter, California. He targeted young women and couples, often breaking into their homes at night. His modus operandi included tying up his victims and using a variety of weapons to intimidate them.
Trial, and it could take a whopping 30 to 35 years to go from trial to execution.
The details of his crimes were horrifying. He would often stalk his victims before attacking, leaving behind a trail of devastation and unsolved cases that haunted families for decades. After years of investigation, DeAngelo was arrested in April 2018 when DNA evidence linked him to multiple crime scenes. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, which allowed investigators to trace his lineage through a distant relative's DNA profile. This innovative technique ultimately led them to DeAngelo, who lived in Citrus Heights then.
His conviction, the DA's office released some of the video footage of DeAngelo in his cell. Interestingly, it shows him doing things like exercising and climbing on furniture to reach things, which is far different from the image he presented in court.
In June 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to many more uncharged offenses as part of a plea deal that spared him the death penalty. During his sentencing hearing on August 21, 2020, held in a makeshift courtroom at Sacramento State University due to COVID-19 precautions, he faced the families of his victims.
Joseph DeAngelo wore an orange jumpsuit and a blank expression to court today. The accused Golden State Killer stared forward, mouth agape, as the judge just kept on reading, down a list of carnage prosecutors say he doled out.
Count 9, Ventura County.
It took the judge more than 15 minutes to read all the charges prosecutors filed. More could still come, but the numbers are already staggering. DeAngelo's charged with 13 murders. 10 of the victims died in double murders, spanning more than a 10-year time frame across 5 California counties. One of those names,
Murdered Lyman Smith, a human being,
was the father of Jennifer Carroll.
My dad and my stepmother were murdered in 1980. We didn't, at the time, it was a small town murder. We didn't know who did it. It was so gruesome and bloody and personal because they were killed with a log.
Their murders in Ventura are the only ones in the case without a certain date.
He finally spoke up with a mask covering his face, expressing sorrow for the pain he caused. I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I have hurt. The judge overseeing the case, Michael Bowman, imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that DeAngelo would spend the rest of his life behind bars.
If you can't afford one on your own, state law says the court may require a defendant to file a financial statement to decide whether he qualifies. That'll be done in secret, but it may be a moot point. Defending a case like this can cost millions, and state law also says if it's a death penalty case, he has to have a defense attorney, whether he wants one or not. At Sacramento County Jail, Brandon Ritteman.
The prosecution team included Anne Marie Schubert, Sacramento County's district attorney, who who emphasized the importance of bringing closure to the victims' families after decades of suffering. The case was heard in Sacramento County Superior Court, where justice was finally served for those who had long awaited answers about their loved ones' fates. It ends with his lifetime sentencing in jail.
Find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, signed foreperson. In the District Court for Humboldt County, State of Iowa, plaintiff versus Michael Richard Swanson, defendant, number FECR 008863, verdict form, count 2. The jury has returned the following verdict. Verdict form number 1, we find the defendant guilty of robbery in the first degree, signed foreperson. Have I accurately portrayed your verdict, sir? And do the rest of you agree with that representation? Very well.
Let's move ahead to our third case. Michael Swanson's case is like a haunted case that began on November 15, 2010, when he committed 2 shocking murders. At just 17 years old, Swanson stole his mother's Jeep and drove to a convenience store in Algona, Iowa, armed with a .40 caliber Beretta handgun.
Smiled at cameras and reporters.
Those first few pictures of him were really hard. When he was walking out of the jail, those were really, really hard. I honestly try not to think about him.
Like the rest of us, that was the first time Mandy and Robin Myers saw the teenager accused of killing their mother, Sheila.
Inside the Crossroads convenience store, he faced 47-year-old Vicki Bowman Hall, demanding cash and cigarettes. After she resisted, he shot her without hesitation, leaving her lifeless on the floor.
2 months into your 18th year, and you have 4 gray walls to look forward to for the rest of your life.
Smiling and smirking, Michael Swanson appeared in 2 Iowa courtrooms today to learn his fate, and he got an earful.
And you have put my family, the other family, and your family through hell.
Swanson was sentenced in Fort Dodge for the murder of Sheila Myers.
But Swanson's night of terror didn't end there. He drove another 25 miles to a different convenience store in Humboldt, where he encountered Sheila Myers. Just like before, he pointed his gun at her and pulled the trigger, killing her as well. Swanson fled the scene with only $31 and some cigarettes in his pocket.
Michael said, quote, "I felt powerful. I just didn't care," unquote.
After the murders, the law quickly tracked him down, and he was arrested. During the investigation, it became clear that Swanson had a troubled past filled with behavioral issues. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and had a history of stealing and violence. Despite these warnings, he was released from a treatment center shortly before the murders.
I then intentionally, deliberately, and with premeditation shot the clerk, causing her to die. I did this with a specific intent to kill her.
In 2011, Swanson faced trial for his crimes. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and first-degree robbery for both killings. Swanson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but his story didn't end there.
Fact statements. 2 of Bowman Hall's sisters read brief statements, and her daughter Jillian shared several memories of her mother in an emotional...
Cold-blooded murder, young man.
As Michael Swanson was sentenced, he grinned, smiled, and laughed, but when he came into the courtroom, he appeared emotionless.
In 2013, the governor of Iowa commuted the life sentences of several young criminals, including Swanson, to 60 years, allowing him a chance at bail in the future. However, his violent behavior continued even in prison.
The judge called the case sad and senseless.
Cold-blooded murder, young man. And your counsel wants us to believe that you lack the capacity, that you were insane. And I don't buy into that. You are dangerous, you are unpredictable, and there is no place for you in an open, law-abiding society. Prison for the rest of your life is the only alternative, and the court intends to follow through.
As he left the courtroom, Swanson smiled once again.
In 2015, he was involved in an incident where he cut another inmate with a knife, leading to an additional 25-year sentence for attempted murder. Here is the wrap-up of this young boy's case.
He showed you a fraudulent recording where they allege that I beat Kenyatta Barron to death. He talked about Mr. Khalil Brown, my neighbor who stayed across the street. But if Mr. Khalil Brown was a help to them proving me guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, they would have called Mr. Khalil Brown. But I called Mr. Khalil Brown to be a witness for me. And I didn't ask him to lie about one thing that he saw that night. I asked him to tell the jury exactly what he saw that night. And you have to ask yourself why that is. Because he's playing a fraudulent damn recording of me beating Kenyatta Barron 15 damn times when that did not happen. And like I told you earlier, you will know the truth, whether in this trial or the next one. Better believe it. If you think I'm here to play around with y'all, God damn it, I'm not. I did kill Kenyatta Barron. But I want you to tell it like it is.
Let's have a look at our fourth case. On March 18, 2018, in Riverview, Florida, Ronnie O'Neill III committed inexpressible acts against his family. That night, O'Neill shot his girlfriend Kenyatta Barron with a shotgun, killing her instantly.
Computers showed jurors a bent and broken shotgun they say was used by Ronnie O'Neill to first shoot and then beat Kenyatta Barron to death at their Riverview home. Jurors also watched a video today of the chaotic scene in March of 2018 as recorded by a neighbor. As first responders arrived, Barron's lifeless body was in front of a neighbor's home. The state contends after Ronnie O'Neill killed Kenyatta Barron, he then murdered his disabled daughter with an axe before stabbing.
In a display of violence, he then turned on their 9-year-old daughter, Ron Nevea, using a hatchet to impose deadly impacts. The brutality didn't stop there. He also attacked his 8-year-old son, Ronnie O'Neill IV, stabbing him and attempting to set him on fire.
Remember if it was a deputy or a bystander came by and said that there's another child inside the house.
Foster entered the home.
I could see a faint orange glow somewhat off to my left.
And described a nightmarish scene.
And I realized that the floor was covered in blood.
In heavy smoke, he crawled to a back bedroom.
Everything in the room was on fire, so clothes, wall, ceiling. Once again, visibility was limited.
And in the middle of the flames, found what he was looking for.
I thought I had found a patient.
He and another firefighter took the little girl outside, but it was too late.
It began with a frantic 911 call from Kenyatta, desperately begging for help as O'Neill's rage increased. When the police arrived, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Despite suffering severe injuries, little Ronnie managed to survive and later attested against his father, recounting the terrifying events of that night. His bravery in the face of such trauma was nothing short of remarkable. As the case went to trial, O'Neill chose to represent himself, which shocked many. His courtroom behavior was irregular, filled with outbursts and conspiracy theories. He showed no guilt for his actions, claiming he was not sorry for what he did. During the trial, he even attempted to cross-examine his son, a moment that left many in the courtroom stunned.
It's all said and done. You will see who is the mass murderers in Tampa Bay.
In July 2021, after a jury found him guilty on all counts, O'Neill received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of bail. The judge, Michelle Cisco, described the case as the worst she had ever seen, emphasizing the cruelty of his actions.
Barron and Ron Nevea were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, that they suffered tremendously before dying.
She expressed her emotional disruption over the evidence presented, particularly the tragic fate of Ron Nevea, a child who deserved protection from the very person who was supposed to love her. It's a wrap-up for this case.
I'm going to, Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, Ms. Simmons has asked for a moment to talk with you privately. I'm going to grant.
Let's move ahead to our last case. In 2017, Nelson was arrested for the brutal killing of 66-year-old retired teacher Linda Mae Henson in Florida. The crime took place in her home in the small town of St. Petersburg, where Nelson, a former neighbor, had a history of troubling behavior and run-ins with the law.
Eligibility for the death penalty for count 1.
We, the jury, unanimously find that the aggravating factors that were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, Section A, outweigh the mitigating circumstances established, Section C above, as to count 1. Yes. E, jury verdict as to death penalty. Having unanimously found that at least one aggravating factor has been established beyond a reasonable doubt, Section A, that the aggravating factors are sufficient to warrant a sentence of death, Section B, and the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating circumstances, Section D, we, the jury, unanimously find that Scott Edward Nelson should be sentenced to death. No. Dated this 11th day of July 2019 in Orlando, Orange County, Florida, signed by the foreperson. Members of the jury, I'm going to ask each of you individually about the verdict that you have just heard. The question pertains to whether the verdict, as read by me, was correctly stated. Do you, Juror 874, agree that at least one member of the jury voted for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole? Do you, Juror 254, agree that at least one member of the jury voted for a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole?
On that fateful day, Nelson broke into Henson's home, where he attacked her with a blunt object. The details of the crime were horrific. Henson suffered severe injuries before succumbing to her wounds. After the murder, Nelson fled the scene, but was quickly arrested by local authorities thanks to tips from concerned neighbors who had seen him moving around.
Bought the murder weapons, a knife, duct tape, and zip ties 2 weeks before forcing his way into a swanky Winter Park home. He kidnapped her, stole her money, tied her up, covered her face with duct tape, and stabbed her to death in a field. The medical examiner said it took her at least 2 painful minutes to die.
2 minutes is a very long time when you have duct tape around your head and you've been stabbed 7 times.
The robbery was planned, yes, but the murder was after the robbery had gone completely wrong.
Nelson's defense team trying to convince the jury that the murder was not premeditated and that he was depressed and had a rough upbringing. Court will reconvene this morning at 9 a.m. and the jury will continue to deliberate. The 12-member jury must...
The case was heard in Pinellas County Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Chris Hellinger. During the trial, prosecutor John O'Neill presented compelling evidence against Nelson, including DNA found at the crime scene and witness testimonies that placed him at Henson's home on the day of the murder.
Into words feels like a disservice to the absolute best human being I have ever known. It's a tragedy. It's foreign. It's a language that I don't know how to speak. It was never supposed to be this way.
Jennifer Fulford's daughter, Hannah Geist, spoke to jurors this afternoon, not saying what she wants to see happen to her mother's killer, Scott Nelson, but how she remembers her.
My mom was my best friend. I mean that in every sense of the phrase.
Geist was the 4th person to speak to jurors during the first day of the penalty phase. Prior to her, a law enforcement officer.
During sentencing, the judge quickly admonished him for his outburst and ordered him to quiet. Despite his claims of innocence, the jury found Scott Nelson guilty of first-degree murder after deliberating for only a few hours. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, without parole. That's a wrap on the most brutal courtroom moments. Let me know in the comments which one shocked you the most. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more gripping content.